Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. I'll be honest, when I first thought of doing video game reviews, I never envisioned that there would come a day when I would look at a Torchlight game and call it a disappointment. The first game was the one that made me get a Steam account, which was my first look at how massive the gaming industry really is, at least relative to what I grew up with. Before that, the original Diablo set the standard for what I love in video games, as it had pretty much everything you could ask for. Between a solid core gameplay loop, tons of replayability, and excellent atmosphere, it's a really great game, and one that was played and replayed a lot in my family. And it's not as if I didn't have reason to be excited for the Torchlight series to continue, as when you look at my Steam account, Torchlight 2 is my most played game. Assuming you ignore the Skinner box I left running for longer than I should have, and a game which is technically a collection of games, so it doesn't count. So what exactly happened that led me to this point? To declare Torchlight 3 a tragic disappointment. To put it mildly, a hell of a lot. To start us off, let's talk about the winding pathway this game took to being released. First off, you have Relic, hot off the heels from Torchlight 2's release, basking in the sun from a job well done. Wanting to branch out, two of the lead developers, namely Travis Baldry and Eric Schaefer, split off to make Rebel Galaxy, a neat little game that I really need to find time to finish. As for the rest of them, they decided that it would be fun to make a game that wasn't Torchlight, after having worked on the franchise for around half a decade. So they set out to make a Zelda-esque action-adventure called Hop. Another neat little game that caught my attention not just for who developed it, but also because it was a narrative told with zero dialogue. Unfortunately, they released it within a week of the games industry collectively driving itself mad over the game journalist clique's inability to play Cuphead. And instead of showing a shred of self-awareness, the clique decided the best way to respond was to say, how dare this game not be accessible to brain-dead morons like us, despite the fact that they had a perfectly good game they could have deflected to as the more accessible experience. And before you ask, I am totally not bitter about Relic closing its doors a few months later due to what I can only assume is a result of poor sales. Whatever gave you that idea? For better or worse though, the two developers who split off to make Rebel Galaxy ended up not being the only ones, because another lead, namely Max Schaefer, was eager to do a Torchlight MMO they had been publicly talking about even before Torchlight 2 released. Seeing that Relic weren't keen on it yet, he made a new studio called Ectra Games for the project. A few years would pass, people would forget Torchlight exists, and then out of nowhere, this thing called Torchlight Frontiers shows up, and looks like it could be really interesting. And then a very small number of people got a hold of the game and realized there might be some problems from this change in direction. Because on top of MMO elements, they were also experimenting with this sideways progression thing that meant you focused on gear for a specific area that would only be useful in said area. Honestly, I never did understand how it works since I never got my hands on it, and apparently a lot of other people didn't get it either, because a while later they looked at the feedback and said, you know, we wanted to release this as a free-to-play MMO, but what you really want is Torchlight 3. So we're gonna make this game Torchlight 3. However, because the publisher likely bankrolled this on the assumption we'd have a free-to-play business model, we're also gonna have an online-only early access version, complete with its own Era 37, and when it actually releases, it may have offline single-player, but it's also gonna be twice the cost of the previous game. Have fun storming the castle again? So anyone looking at this would think, yeah, this has a lot of ways it could go south. But to further doom the game, it chose what might have been the absolute worst time to release. You thought Hop getting overshadowed by Cuphead was bad? Oh, do I have a story for you. To set the scene, let's take you back to September of 2020. It's a miserable time in the world, and the games industry is no different, as it was still reeling from the controversial release of The Last The Last of Us Part 2. A game which divided people right down the middle for its treatment of the main characters from the first game, and which left even more people upset because the studio decided the best way to approach the leaks for that game was to copyright strike literally everything. Needless to say, I do not own nor ever intend to own a PlayStation 5 because of that, as I like having the ability to speak my mind without an overzealous company going after me over a meme. But then, it happened. An absolute wrecking ball calling itself Hades swung in, reminding everyone that for one thing it exists, because why wouldn't you forget about a game that spent its first year in a store that doesn't even have a shopping cart? But most importantly, it's a game by Supergiant, doing what they do best, and it was awesome. Visceral combat, excellent music, frenetic gameplay, and a surprisingly good narrative for a game with roguelike elements. It had it all, and it was glorious. And then Torchlight 3 released less than a month later to very little fanfare, with those who were watching just scratching their heads as to why it chose then of all times to exit early access. At the time, I still hadn't gotten off the Hades train, so I took a bit of time to explore it, observe that it is indeed a video game, and then went back to fighting my way out of the underworld. So eventually the time comes when I've seen to everything I care to within Hades, and have had such a fun time that there's no way I'm not reviewing the game. So at long last, as I'm working on the review and maybe exploring a little bit more here and there, I'll finally have time to...
Oh god, no, I do not have time for this!
You know what? I streamed my first impressions of Hades and Torchlight 3 on my second channel. It would only be fair to do the same for this game as well. And since this one has a demo, it's not like I'm staking any money on it yet. Besides, it's a Warriors game. If it's anything like the other two I've played, it'll be an okay distraction for a while, but won't have the gameplay depth or longevity of, hang on, this is a spin-off to Breath of the Wild, and apes virtually every combat mechanic from it. The performance is dodgy, but it's actually a lot more skill-based than I expected. I'm gonna end up reviewing this one too, aren't I? I mean, it's not like it'll be so gripping that I'll complete this giant map full of crap within 15 days of the game releasing or anything, at a time when it'll basically be the only thing I play while wrapping up the Hades review. Except it was. And I had a really fun time with it. And the first wave of DLC has been a welcome inclusion. In case it isn't clear yet, by the fact that we've been here for a few minutes and still haven't discussed the gameplay of Torchlight 3, in order for it to stand out among the two games it was sandwiched between, it had to basically be the second coming of Christ. And unfortunately for it, the development cycle and Steam reviews weren't one to inspire confidence, so I went into this one expecting something to be off. In hindsight, what I was hoping for was it to be either so good or so bad that at least I could have a good time either singing its praises or ripping and tearing until it is done. Instead, I got a resounding meh. But Jay, I hear you say, are you sure you're not saying all this because the genre just doesn't interest you anymore? The last time you talked about a Diablo-style game was the console version of Diablo 3 back in 2018, and then you let a Warriors game drag you away from one? And, to be fair, the same thought did cross my mind. As a result, when I wanted to give a channel update towards the end of 2020, I figured it would be a good time to test that theory. I've played Torchlight 2 so much that I could practically sleepwalk through it, so it wouldn't distract me too much while giving the update and would ensure that the stream isn't staring at a blank screen for its entirety. So when the time rolled around, I booted it up and had my answer within minutes. Had I truly fallen out of love with the Diablo-style genre? No. No, I hadn't. Torchlight 2 is still great. In fact, I'm leading with this because I'll inevitably be comparing Torchlight 2 and 3 to each other throughout this video. Because to be really sure of my assessment, I played both games to completion with their respective mage classes, and then tinkered with the other classes in Torchlight 3 after that. If you're concerned that this will create an undue bias against Torchlight 3, I fully recognize that this is the case. Because how dare I have high standards for a game that's billed as a sequel to something that came out over 8 years before it? Methinks I'm allowed to be a little miffed if there isn't a substantial improvement. So let's not waste any more time and talk about what it did and didn't get right. As our first topic, let's take a look at something which is, for the most part, a positive improvement, specifically the relics. In essence, the third skill list you would have seen in Torchlight 2 is replaced by one of 5 relics which you choose at character creation. The active abilities are all gated behind a long cooldown or this relic meter that fills up as you deal damage, meaning the abilities aren't used very often but tend to be rather effective. It technically means there's less unique skills per class, even beyond the actual smaller number relative to the previous game, but it's something which can drastically alter how you play a character. For instance, a lot of the Blood Drinker's skills revolve around dealing damage with your basic attack, which can lead you to pick skills that would lean into that. Alternatively, the Bane Relic has a lot of skills that revolve around summoning, which could lead you to focus on ranged attacks or skills that could synergize with it. To show how this could affect your build, let's talk about the class where this is best exemplified, the Railmaster. His unique gimmick is that he has a train which follows him around wherever he goes, with the train being able to deal damage or offer utility like applying elemental effects or mitigating damage. Most of his abilities are on a cooldown instead of using mana, so to give some resource management, he has an endurance meter which when full can be used to add special effects to an ability. For my time with the Railmaster, I used the Blood Drinker relic, which meant my build was focused on throwing out as many basic attacks as I could, in order to summon these whirling blades and apply damage over time to everything that moves. Since there's also a ground slam ability that at full endurance will increase your attack speed, I leaned into that over bolstering my train. However, if I wish to do a summoning build with the Bane Relic, I could see that being fairly effective. Not only does the Railmaster have a few range skills, one of them will summon a pickaxe thrower at full endurance, so all you need to do is give the Railmaster a ranged weapon, and you can sit back with your train and watch your minions go to town. That sort of versatility is something that adds a lot of different ways for you to build out your characters, and is a welcome addition as a result. Unfortunately, the rest of them didn't end up being as interesting and are also endemic of a lot of the problems this game introduces. Perhaps the most disappointing in that regard was the Dusk Mage, which is the class I really should have enjoyed. I'm someone who absolutely loves the Mage archetype, of throwing out a variety of powerful spells that lay waste to everything in sight. Unfortunately, the Dusk Mage's only unique aspect from previous mage classes is that you're basically forced to use both of his unique skill trees, as otherwise you don't unlock the Super Saiyan mode that increases your damage and takes away his mana costs. If you want to purely use one type of magic, you just don't have an important part of his toolkit. Granted, there is a degree to which they're useful in different circumstances, so it's not the biggest deal ever, but the Dusk Mage is also a major example of the problems with animations and sound effects. Before I go too far, I should say that the animations and sound effects are not technically bad. In fact, when compared to what came before, the graphical fidelity is definitely higher, which is especially obvious in the environment. However, when you make those comparisons, everything seems a lot more subdued and leaves much less of an impact. To explain what I mean, let's talk about how much the sound effects and animations add to Torchlight 2. To start, the abilities are incredibly flashy. Take one look at the bright colors and particle effects, and you have a clear sense of power communicated from a strike. To further generate that for the player, there are very few, if any, abilities that fire as soon as you push the button, as there's often a half-second delay or more as a wind-up animation plays. Not only does this create risk and reward to keep you from mindlessly spamming, especially on a glass cannon like the Ember Mage, it's another way to signify the power in a skill, as your character is having to physically exert themselves to use it. And if you want a perfect example of all of this working in tandem, I present to you the Flame Hammer. That's the Engineer's starting ability, by the way. And while that example was bolstered by a unique aspect of the Engineer, it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The grunt from the exertion of lifting up and slamming the hammer down. The colorful explosion radiating around and in front of the hit. The sound effect as jets of fire seek out nearby enemies and ensure that they stay down. It's an ability that immediately gets you hyped to play more due to the power conveyed by it. Even on a faster ability like the Engineer's Shield Breaker, you get a wide blue sweep that effectively distinguishes itself from the background and enemies, even in an area that's tinted a cool blue. To offer a more comparative example to the Dusk Mage, Torchlight 2's Ember Mage has a similar approach, with the starting ability having her stand in place and shoot firebolt after firebolt, each one causing her to reel back a bit as the bolt pierces through enemies. Another ability has her draw back and lean her whole body into launching multiple ice bolts, which then bounce off of walls and enemies as they freeze said enemies into place. But then you get to Torchlight 3, and the increased graphical fidelity ironically hurts it more than helps it. The reason for this is that it has a much more uniform color palette between the environment, enemies, and spell effects, meaning it's a lot easier for everything to blend together. Also, the windup for spells is almost completely gone, with a lot of relic abilities especially just appearing out of thin air without any fanfare. Before, if you wanted a column of fire to rain down vengeance upon your enemies, you'd have a windup before they seek and destroy. Now you just press a button and watch it go, which isn't as satisfying. This lack of windup may make it easier for a newcomer to get into the game, as it's then safer to spam abilities, but it also takes away some of the impact from said abilities, and lowers the skill ceiling. Because of that, we go from the Magma Spear, which pierces targets and requires you to stand your ground to take advantage of it, to a single coin-like projectile that you limply throw out and hope it does something to a single enemy. As someone who really likes the Mage archetype, this just didn't do it for me. And speaking of the sound effects, I get that they're not going to sound the same relative to what came before, as they set this game 100 years in the future, and it's likely not the same people working on that aspect. But I'm surprised at just how drastically everything's changed. In keeping with what I said about the visuals blending together, sound effects aren't as distinct anymore. Even things which you would expect to be similar are entirely different, such as the goblins. Whereas before they had some really weird screams that immediately distinguished them compared to other games, now they're much more similar to every other goblin sound. They can sort of justify this since they received some spoken dialogue this time, but you'd think they'd at least have the same tenor to their voice or something. It's not quite as bad as if a Diablo game would have changed the sound effect that plays when coins drop, but just as it would be jarring for that to happen, cases like this occur fairly frequently and are still really jarring. Moving on to the other classes, next up is the Forged class, which is probably the most novel one in the game. Instead of summoning an automaton, you are the automaton, able to sit in place to pour out damage from a cannon in the center of your chest, or to get up close and personal with a volley of blows. It's a novel concept, though whether it's because of unlucky weapon drops or a relic that works better in the late game, I just could not get enough damage out of this guy. Another possible reason might be because the game heavily favors AoE, as it seems like I can't turn a corner without a horde of small monsters crawling out to say hello. It's not as if this is anything new, but it's used to such an extent that it's like a 6-year-old just discovered the word discombobulate and now finds any and every excuse to use it. Because of just how many enemies can flood out of an area, it can be hard to assess how dangerous a given section is going to be. and leads you to naturally favor AoE skills and weapons. And since I leaned into the Forge class's single target machine gun rather than the shotgun blast, I think you can guess how well that worked for me. It's not as if I had zero AoE, but it required me to first deal damage with another weapon, then this heat meter with specific skills, and then use what built up from that in this steam meter to actually get the AoE I needed. I like this idea in theory, but it looks like I would need to go back to the drawing board to make it work in practice. To be fair, having better single target did serve me well when we got to the beefier enemies, even if said enemies feel like massive bullet sponges after having to focus on AoE so we can walk more than 2 feet in the overworld. Seriously, the elite enemies on Torchlight 2 weren't even this bullet spongy, and I played on hard mode throughout my time with Torchlight 3. The next class on the chopping block is the Sharpshooter, which does add a unique spin on the rogue archetype. The unique gimmick this time is that she's collected a variety of trinkets from prior adventures, which she can use as active abilities. All of them are on a cooldown, but will also cost the next few casts of a skill from her other unique list to add some special effect. For instance, this poison projectile will also imbue the next few skills she uses with poison, whereas this summoning skill will cause the next few casts to summon extra help. To keep you from going overboard, they give her an ammo limit, and only allow you to apply the special bonus from one artifact skill at a time, which encourages you to consider which one will benefit you the most. And even once you start getting a few more and are having trouble with ammo management, you have a reload ability that refills your ammo and resets all your cooldowns, which means you get a nice rhythm going as you cycle through these abilities. Again, the animations could be better to make this feel more impactful, but at its core, it's a neat toolkit that worked really well with the Bane relic. And finally, the Cursed Captain class is something they added as part of their final update. The unique resource this time are doubloons, which can be earned by dealing damage to enemies from opening chests and through certain skills, which can then be spent on active abilities and summons. Since I prefer going the summon route, I heavily leaned into that, and between the sheer number of minions you can put out on top of the high damage from the relic it shows, it was a really compelling class. A bit slow to get going perhaps, as it wasn't until I unlocked a skill that could earn me doubloons that it started going haywire, but at least it made getting through the remainder that I wished to see to a hell of a lot faster. That covers all of the classes and some of the issues related to them, so let's move on to talking about a few more general things, starting with the user interface. If there was any point in this review where I would be overly biased, this would be it, because Torchlight 2 has the advantage of using an interface that dates back literal decades at this point, meaning there is an inherent familiarity. This is further the case because of the Diablo-style games I've played, there isn't a good analog to anything that came before, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but could lead me to have problems finding my way around, at least initially. To make this even worse, you get little to no explanation of anything when the game starts, which meant on top of an unfamiliar interface, there was a lot of information laid out that I didn't have any context for, such as all the stuff related to your fort. And before I just gloss over that, the fort isn't something I see worth discussing, because it was created in a time when this was going to be an MMO and you needed a place where you could put the shared stash and some account-wide stat boosters. And were it still an MMO, it would also be a good place to show off given your ability to decorate it. But since the decoration part is negligible to me as someone who typically plays Diablo-style games alone, there's not much to say about it. Getting back to the interface, my main issue with it is that it packed a lot of the crucial information into the center of the screen while leaving a substantial amount of empty space on the bottom and just underneath the banner. While it may be more aesthetically pleasing, it means there's a bit more menu navigation involved in order to find your way around, which means more button presses and more opportunities to get lost. Perhaps the best example of this pertains to the inventory, and to explain why, let's take a brief detour to talk about how potions work. With only one of the classes using a traditional mana pool now, mana potions have been completely removed, whereas health potions have been greatly limited. You can now only have a small number of potions at any one time, but they now heal you based on a percentage of your max health, which is a good way to ensure your potions always remain relevant. They also confer some other benefits, such as shoving enemies away from you or removing status effects like poison. There is a degree to which shoving enemies away isn't ideal for melee characters, but if you get trapped in a corner by the deluge of enemies you run into, it's not a bad thing to have, so you take the good with the bad in that case. Due to the fact that you can only carry oh so many potions now, you could have easily moved them from this tab over here to below your pet's inventory, which may not have appeared as symmetrical but would have been easier to access. Without the potions existing in this tab, there's not much reason to go here besides maybe gathering rewards from defeating powerful monsters. But since most of those affect the fort, the only time I ever felt the need to open it was when the inventory slots filled up. For an example that requires less explanation, it used to be that you could look at both your pet's inventory and your own at the same time, which means you can't necessarily take a look at all the weapons and armor you have at a glance now. In fact, that was one of the great benefits of using the dual panel layout, as you could contrast your pet's inventory with your own and had a large space to see exactly what your attributes were alongside your skills. However, because your attributes are handled in the back end now instead of being chosen by you, they move character information like that to the left side of the screen. And since there's no contrast for it beside a slightly blurred background, it ends up being white noise when all the information you need to worry about is to the right of the screen anyway. As a result, you end up just looking at a single third or quarter of the screen for the sake of information that could have been spread out more sensibly. As for the combat interface, it works well enough, though I am kind of disappointed that we can't have as many active skills as before. Perhaps that's a compromise made for parity on the console version, as while you could hide more ability slots behind weapon swapping in Torchlight 2, that's a mechanic that was left behind with this game, which is another disappointing restriction. While we're on the subject though, we may as well talk about the game balance as a whole. I've already discussed how the game seems to overly favor AoE, but there's plenty of other aspects to discuss. To start, there's the fact that weapon swapping has been taken out, which was a neat feature in Torchlight 2 that allowed you to switch from a melee to a ranged weapon with the push of a button. This then meant if you were low on mana, it was easy enough to keep firing from a distance if you also didn't want to risk your hide too much. You'd think that such a mechanic would be welcome here as well, especially for cases like the Blood Drinker relic that could work in either environment, but for whatever reason, that was left on the cutting room floor. Perhaps they were concerned about how legendary items work, as while they've effectively replaced Torchlight 2's unique items, each now has a special ability that's exclusive to the weapon name, which might have caused issues if you could go immediately from one legendary weapon to another, especially if both weapons give you different active abilities. Still, while this would have been really hard to handle from a programming perspective, and could have had some interesting effects on the game balance, it's something that I do subjectively miss. Next up, it seems like it's much easier to fully max out your skills now, as while there used to be hard limits on how many points you could pour into a skill, now you can max out your starting ability by level 10 if you so desire. It's something which I find to be peculiar, but given they've made different skill trees reliant on each other to an extent, it's not something which I expect would be a major problem. Finally, as one last major game balance concern, your overall mobility is substantially lower. On top of every single mobility spell being locked behind a fairly long cooldown, your base movement speed is also slower overall. It's an ironic problem all things considered, as the issue with the animations is that they're over and done with too soon without there being much of an impact to them. But the one thing they did slow down is how quickly you can move through the world. If I had to hazard a guess as to why, this is a result of two things. First, because the Dusk Mage is the only class with a proper mana pool, they needed another way to regulate our mobility spells. Before now, if you wanted to spam them, you had to be willing to give up a significant amount of mana, which created an effective risk and reward between taking out an opponent versus keeping yourself out of harm's way, which is an aspect of the Ember Mage I really liked managing. Even if after a while I just gave up and threw all of my golden mana potions at the problem, though that could be a good reason why they decided to lock them behind cooldowns. On top of this, since Torchlight 3 was originally intended as an MMO, the screen would get incredibly messy if every single player in an instance was able to just keep spamming movement spell after movement spell after movement spell. It would also help to keep someone from rushing in at the last minute and stealing the experience or loot away from someone. However, since the latter isn't in play anymore, it stands as an odd decision that really doesn't do the game any favors. So after saying all of this, there's a lot of things that leave the game as a disappointing sequel and a mediocre game. But my last point is the final nail in the coffin. It uses the waypoint system to save your progress. This might not sound like a big deal, but the waypoint system is the reason why my father never finished Diablo 2. And it wasn't from lack of trying either, as before I was allowed to play the first game, he had gone through it something like 10 times already. Back then, it was his way of unwinding after a long day. And since it was a video game, my siblings and I could also have a fun time watching him or eventually joining him in a LAN session. However, when he got to Diablo 2, he found he couldn't just save and load whenever he wanted because of the waypoint system. Thanks to that, he encountered a moment where he spent over an hour looking for one, something needed to be done around the house, he had to put it down and never picked it back up. Luckily, with Torchlight 1 and 2, that wasn't an issue, to where we could even stop and start our multiplayer sessions without any concern for where we were or how far along a quest we had gone. However, even if this game were the most amazing Diablo-style game on the market, I can't recommend it to him purely on this basis, and he has more time clocked into Torchlight 2 than I do. I get that this was an MMO before it was a traditional Diablo-style game, and I get that the majority of people who throw all their time at the genre might not care, but to put this into perspective, all of us are going to eventually be at that stage. God willing, I'm gonna have a family to worry about eventually, and unless I somehow manage to turn this hobby into a job, games like this won't be as easy to jump into, because sometimes life happens faster than the waypoint system will let me step away. And even putting aside that aspect, it also means I can't disengage from the game on my own terms. If I've had my fill for a while, I can't just put it down for a bit and then jump back in right at the same point. I have to finish out the section, meaning I'm gonna find myself even more frustrated at any pre-existing issues. I get why this system would exist in a multiplayer game, and if it were still an MMO, I wouldn't make a big deal out of it, but in a single player game, this system is arguably an even worse inclusion than always online DRM. As we close out this video, I would like to be clear as to why I consider this game to be a tragic disappointment. It's not that the game is outright bad, as there's a lot of really cool ideas buried within it, and a lot of substantial improvements that were made on its predecessor. The relics are a cool way to add replayability, the classes are very unique spins on the old archetypes, and the environment is really detailed and pleasant to look at. The problem is that these great improvements are mired in lackluster execution. It's harder to tell what's going on, the animations and sound effects aren't as satisfying as they were before, and by reducing the wind-up time on attacks, a lot of the punch has been taken out of them. And unfortunately, a lot of the changes that were made, such as the lower movement speed, are so integral to the game balance that it would be impossible to change them without fundamentally changing the game in its entirety. I can't bring myself to hate it due to what it gets right, but due to what it gets wrong, it just feels like the textbook definition of wasted potential. And it seems that the powers that be have determined the same thing, as after a major update that added the Cursed Captain and substantial balance updates towards the end of May, the game is no longer being officially supported. Extra is officially working under Zynga now, whereas Perfect World will retain the rights to the IP to use as they see fit. Which is a shame because the issues that are present are ones that could theoretically be amended in a future game, similarly to how Torchlight 1's balance issues and lack of multiplayer were fixed in Torchlight 2. But it looks like the chances of that occurring are slim at this point. With any luck, someone else will be able to pick up the torch, as it were, but for now, my recommendation would be to buy Torchlight 2 if you've never played it before, and if you have played it, then it might be time to go through the Steam Workshop again to see what kind of crazy mods have been added since you last played. With that said, that's all I wish to discuss on the topic. I don't normally spend as long as I did rattling on about the path the game took to being released, but considering how storied an adventure it was, I felt it was necessary to share, if only to really hammer home how I approached the game. If you're someone who's never played Torchlight 2 before, then you may get more out of the game than I did, but that is sadly not a perspective you'll find represented here. I suspect that I'll end up doing a retrospective on Torchlight 2 at some point to really demonstrate why I like it so much, but for now, thank you all for watching to the end, and please let me know if that's something you'd like to see. Just don't ask me to review the Diablo 2 remake when it shows up, as while it could be good, I also have this thing called long-term memory, which makes it really annoying to play anything by a company which has had so many PR disasters in the last few years, you could make a 5-hour documentary on them. And bear in mind, I wrote and recorded that line before the latest PR disaster, and given all the hell that's seemingly been dug up on account of it, you could probably make it a 6-hour documentary now. Regardless, thank you all once again for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.